Welcome, brave souls, to another haunting episode of our scary stories. I am your host, lurking in the shadows of your deepest fears. Tonight, we venture into a tale where an innocent fascination turns into a twisted nightmare. So turn down the lights, if you dare, and make sure to look over your shoulder. You never know what might be watching. Prepare yourself for the harrowing journey into the soul photographer. The first thing that hit Owen as he pushed open the creaky door was the musty aroma, a mixture of old leather, mothballs, and the crisp tang of yellowing paper. It was like stepping into another world, a cocoon insulated from the bustling streets of the city that thrived outside the shop's dust-smeared windows. Dim light spilled from tarnished chandeliers, casting hazy silhouettes on curios and heirlooms that cluttered wooden shelves. An ancient gramophone crooned a haunting tune, its sound wavering through the air as if filtered through time itself. Owen, a lanky man in his late 20s, felt his heartbeat slow, absorbed by the quietude. He was an introverted soul, a photographer by trade who often found more solace in the inanimate subjects of his lens than in human interaction. Today, he was on a quest for the peculiar, an exotic lens or an antique flash perhaps, something to add a unique touch to his portfolio. His eyes skimmed the random assortment, typewriters with rusting keys, ornate vases exuding an air of lost royalty, dog-eared novels, and tarnished mirrors. His gaze settled on a glass cabinet near the back, its contents dimly lit. Cameras, not just any vintage ones, they're brass and leather worn from decades, maybe even centuries of capturing moments. As Owen approached, one model caught his eye. It was unlike the others, a curious blend of old and new, as if it were a bridge between eras. "You have a good eye, young man." That one special, rasped a voice behind him. Startled, Owen turned to find the shopkeeper, an elderly man with eyes like faded marbles and a stoop that suggested the weight of untold stories. "It's not just any camera. That one has a special lens." The words sank into Owen like a melody. "What makes it so special?" he asked, although part of him hesitated, aware of the old man's unsettling demeanor. The shopkeeper chuckled, a dry, crumbling sound. "Let's just say it captures more than just photographs. It's an experience not easily forgotten." Torn between skepticism and allure, Owen finally yielded to the magnetic pull of the mysterious object. Money was exchanged, a sizable sum but not exorbitant, and the camera was carefully placed into an old leather bag. Exiting the shop, Owen felt both excitement and a peculiar sense of trepidation. Like a child resisting but ultimately yielding to the temptation of a forbidden fruit, he pulled the camera out of its case. He felt an almost reverent urge to test it immediately. As if on cue, a stray dog wandered into the narrow alley beside the shop, nosing at scraps of food littering the ground. Here was a subject unimportant in the grand scheme of things, he reasoned. Owen aimed and clicked. The shutter released with a satisfying, yet oddly melancholic, snap. The dog froze, its eyes becoming vacant. It ambled away, listless, as if the very essence of its being had been drained. Simultaneously, Owen felt a rush of vigor, a sudden buoyancy that filled his lungs with the sweetest air he'd ever inhaled. It was euphoric. Yet, almost instantly, he pushed down a prickling sense of guilt. "It's just a stray," he murmured to himself. "And this energy, this life, I probably just got a kick from trying something new. Yes, that's it. It's coincidental." His rational mind searched for excuses, but deep down, something unspoken gnawed at him. A line had been crossed, the nature of which he couldn't fully comprehend. And whether driven by curiosity or something darker, he felt an irresistible urge to explore this enigma, to pierce the veil that separated the ordinary from the unfathomable. Little did he know that this single act, this one press of a button, had sealed not just the dog's fate, but his own as well, in ways that defied the natural order of life and death. And so, Owen tucked the camera back into its bag, his hands trembling ever so slightly, and headed home, unaware that he was stepping onto a path that meandered through the shadowy recesses of existence, a route from which there was no turning back. And so, in that dim antique shop, on that otherwise unremarkable afternoon, something extraordinary had been set in motion. A tapestry of events had started to weave itself around Owen, its threads spun from the very fabric of souls, threads that would tighten, ensnare, and ultimately define the contours of his destiny. Owen's studio was an oasis of modernity juxtaposed against the musty allure of the antique shop where he'd acquired the curious camera. Stark white walls were illuminated by rows of LED lights, soft boxes, and strobes, their bright artificiality contrasting with the camera's dark, arcane presence. On one wall, a gallery of portraits stood frozen in time, each smile or frown a relic of someone's passing moment. His daily routine was a well-rehearsed dance of practiced movements and rehearsed conversations. A quick adjustment of the tripod, a soft click of the shutter, some polite banter with clients about their day, all punctuated by the perpetual scent of freshly brewed coffee wafting in from the corner espresso machine. But as each day melded into the next, the routine began to feel increasingly tedious, like he was merely shuffling through different shades of the same color. That is, until the antique camera entered his life. With its mysterious presence gnawing at his thoughts, Owen couldn't resist any longer, rationalizing it as a journey into artistic exploration. He began incorporating the antique camera into select photo sessions. First, it was a moody artist eager for a unique portfolio. Then, a brooding couple who wanted to capture their love in an unconventional way. Each time, Owen felt the electrifying surge, a flood of life force that filled him with a sense of intoxicating power and well-being. However, Owen couldn't ignore the changes he began to observe in his subjects. The artist stopped painting, claiming his inspiration had run dry. The once passionate couple quietly separated, each of them becoming distant and detached as if some vital spark had been extinguished. Yet, each session had seemed so ordinary, the flash capturing their visages in a blink of ephemeral light. They'd smiled, thanked Owen, and left, only to return as shells, emotionless and forever altered. The euphoria Owen felt started to mingle with bouts of guilt. The lines between right and wrong blurred into an ethereal haze. He would sit in the dim light of his studio long after his sessions, the walls now a theater for the phantoms of his conscience, a self-portrait of emptiness. His introspection was interrupted when Mark, a close friend and fellow photographer, dropped by unannounced. "Owen, you okay? You've seemed off lately," Mark ventured cautiously, his eyes searching Owen's face for clues. "Off? What do you mean?" Owen deflected, hiding behind a veneer of casualness. "I mean, you look better than ever, energetic, lively, but something's missing. Your eyes, man, they're like deep pools without a bottom. I can't put my finger on it, but be careful, all right." Warning signs blinked in Owen's mind, and the ethical dilemma now unfolded before him with stark clarity. The very fabric of his soul seemed to be fraying, each thread pulling him deeper into a chasm of moral ambiguity. "Thanks, Mark. I'll think about it," he managed to utter, although he knew that thinking was no longer enough. Now, the battle lines were drawn within him, between the thrill of newfound vitality and the darkening shadows of consequence. A profound internal conflict stirred in the depths of Owen's conscience. The antique camera lay on his desk, innocuous yet laden with a weight that seemed to defy gravity. It had become both a gift and a curse, a Pandora's box that, once opened, unleashed questions Owen was not prepared to answer. Yet as he stared into the lens, its glass like the dark eye of some ancient, incomprehensible beast, he realized that his own soul had become the most elusive subject of all. And like the ticking of an unseen clock in a vacant room, time was running out for Owen to decide whether to harness or relinquish the insidious power that now held him in its spectral grip. There would be no turning back. Nestled in a labyrinth of dusty bookshelves and disorganized archives, Owen found himself hunched over a worn-out desk at the local library. The smell of decaying paper and ink filled the air, mingling with the musty odor of a room seldom visited. With each page he turned, his fingers brushed against centuries-old wisdom. Medieval alchemists, Victorian spiritualists, modern parapsychologists, they all seemed to hint at the unimaginable, the capture and manipulation of the human soul. Vague references to lenses that see beyond and mirrors to the ethereal plane began to form an elusive narrative. It seemed absurd, fantastical, but something in the grainy black and white photos of old men with inscrutable eyes and complex apparatus convinced Owen he was skimming the surface of a dark ocean, one he couldn't fully fathom. His phone buzzed, a message on the screen flashed about a wedding gig for the weekend. The money was good, and he could surely use it. Rationalizing the decision as a way to better understand the camera's effects on a larger scale, Owen packed his regular gear along with the antique camera. The wedding unfolded in a spacious hall adorned with white roses, golden ornaments, and fairy lights that seemed to glow with ethereal warmth. As the bride and groom exchanged vows, their love palpable in the smiles they shared, Owen felt a momentary pang of guilt, but it was quickly drowned out by an irresistible compulsion. In that decisive moment, he switched to the antique camera. When the flash subsided, the air felt heavy like the aftermath of a thunderstorm. The bride and groom, along with the entire wedding party, seemed dazed. The laughter and jubilant voices that had filled the hall moments ago now dulled to murmurs and awkward silences. Owen could feel the energy coursing through him, a tidal wave so potent that it was nearly intoxicating. But the room seemed to drain of color, the golds and whites fading into lifeless gray. In the days that followed, the gravity of what Owen had done began to sink in. The bride and groom had separated, their families puzzled and distraught. The friends who had celebrated so joyously now became withdrawn, mechanical in their actions. The community was abuzz with rumors, suspicion gathering like dark clouds on the horizon. Media stories hinted at a mysterious affliction, speculating about psychological disorders or even illicit substances. Unable to bear the guilt and public scrutiny, Owen retreated into himself, his studio becoming a sanctuary or perhaps a prison. Once a space of creativity and passion, it now felt like a tomb, the walls closing in with each passing day. The camera sat there, its dark lens absorbing all light that dared approach it. Its very presence seemed to drain the atmosphere of warmth, as if it were an empty void that swallowed life itself. His phone, once a source of endless notifications and business proposals, lay silent. His social media filled with concerned messages, half-finished conversations, and abandoned plans. Owen realized he was a pariah, not by the judgment of the community, but by the irreparable harm he'd inflicted through his insatiable curiosity. It was as if he'd crossed into a realm from which there was no return, a realm where his actions, like everlasting frames in a film reel, captured moments of devastation rather than beauty. And each frame was etched not just on celluloid, but on the very fabric of his being. A tapestry of shadows that no light could dispel. The feeling was more than guilt. It was an oppressive weight, a recognition of a power he never should have wielded. The antique camera had captured more than photographs. It had captured Owen himself, framing him in a chilling tableau of ethereal darkness from which there seemed to be no escape. With each passing day, Owen's studio felt like a chamber of echoes, each sound reverberating and amplifying his solitude. The air smelled stale, saturated with the ink of old photos and the chemical tang of printer fluids. It was as though the room had absorbed his guilt and regret, radiating it back in a stifling haze that tightened around him like a noose. He found himself staring at the antique camera. It rested on its vintage tripod, an artifact that seemed almost alien in its foreignness, despite its charming exterior. Each time Owen looked at it, he felt a dread so intense it seemed as though the walls were closing in, suffocating him in a cocoon of despair. It was during one of these hypnotic moments that it happened. His finger, trembling as it hovered over the shutter button, slipped. A mechanical click reverberated in the room as though mocking his clumsiness, followed by the merciless burst of the flash. He had photographed himself. Instantly, Owen felt as if the air had been sucked out of his lungs, leaving him gasping in a sudden vacuum. His vision blurred into a swirling vortex of grays and blacks, as if he were spiraling into some bottomless abyss. When his sight returned, he was overwhelmed by an emptiness so profound it seemed to erase his very sense of self. His body felt like a paper-thin shell, devoid of substance or purpose. Yet, within this void, his consciousness floated, disembodied and isolated, but sharply aware. The room appeared different, as though he were viewing it through a lens smudged by a ghostly hand. It was then that he realized his consciousness was trapped within the camera. He was neither fully in the physical world nor entirely removed from it, straddling a terrifying boundary he couldn't understand. Frantically, he willed himself to move, to shout, to make any sign that he was still here. His gaze fell upon a stack of photo papers on the table, and with a surge of desperate energy, he tried to knock it over. Nothing. He focused next on the light switch, willing it to flicker, to give any indication of his presence. Again, nothing. He was a silent observer, a prisoner in his own device, incapable of affecting the world he so devastatingly altered. His eyes, or whatever served as eyes in this new form, landed on his own physical body. It stood motionless, a statue carved from flesh, its eyes vacant and lost. He could neither control it nor communicate through it, a pilot severed from his vessel. And so, Owen understood the irony of his predicament. In capturing the essence of others, he had ensnared himself, becoming both the captor and the captive in a self-woven web of cosmic justice, or perhaps cosmic horror. He couldn't scream, but if he could, would it be out of desperation or acknowledgement of this cruel twist of fate? Within his lens-encased purgatory, Owen was left to ponder this, a silent witness to his own lifeless form and to a room that grew increasingly dim, as though fading from existence, a portrait of emptiness he himself had orchestrated. Within the darkened chamber of the antique camera, Owen sensed a thickening of the atmosphere. It was as if the very walls of this metaphysical space were closing in, pulsating like the chambers of a heart. Yet there was something else, whispers in the murk, the presence of others as lost and formless as he was. It took him a moment to comprehend the staggering realization. He wasn't alone. Faint glimmers emerged, flickering like dying embers, each a captured soul in this loathsome prison. An ethereal chorus of voices started to rise, filling the space with murmurs of lament and accusation. The essence of each individual he'd imprisoned with his camera was here, and they were all aware of their jailer's arrival. One by one, they told their stories, stories of love never confessed, families broken, dreams never pursued, all shattered the moment the flash froze them in perpetual emptiness. Each tale wove a fiber in a tapestry of grief and rage, culminating in a collective resentment that seemed to shake the very foundations of their prison. Among them, a soul with an air of ancient wisdom appeared. Its form, less shapeless than the others, bore a resemblance to the antique shopkeeper. The voice that emanated from it was tinged with a mix of bitterness and weary understanding. You hold in your essence the instrument of our torment, the alchemical invention that trades lives for a fleeting spark of vitality. The shopkeeper's soul began. Do you understand the abomination you've wielded? Owen felt a weight pressing on his formless self, the collective gaze of countless souls affixed on him. The shopkeeper continued, this camera was crafted by a master of forbidden arts. A soul for a soul, vitality traded for void. The loop can be closed, but the cost is one's humanity. In that dark realm, where feelings were transferred as if through osmosis, Owen understood the means to escape. A reset, a loop closed by capturing his own living essence, returning the stolen life forces to their rightful owners. But did he deserve it? Torn between his desperate desire to reverse his grievous mistakes and the palpable weight of his guilt, Owen felt as if he were standing on the edge of an abyss. The void beckoned, promising an eternal escape from the judgment of those he'd wronged, but also trapping him in ceaseless isolation. Each captured soul, in its own way, seemed to implore him to make a choice, their collective voices blending into a haunting requiem for lost possibilities. The shopkeeper's soul alone remained silent, its grim wisdom hanging like a shroud over Owen's existential crossroads. To free himself was to accept a second chance he wasn't sure he deserved. To remain was to bear eternal witness to the suffering he had caused, a punishment that seemed equally fitting. As the walls of his metaphysical prison seemed to close in, the ephemeral voices reaching a crescendo of sorrow and anticipation, Owen knew he had to make his irrevocable choice. Owen focused his nebulous consciousness on the lens of the camera, which now sat abandoned on his studio desk. He had to get out, and not just for himself. The souls trapped with him deserved freedom. A flicker of movement caught his attention. His close friend, Mark, stepped into the studio, his face etched with concern. Owen willed every fragment of his being into a pinpoint of light, a desperate signal. He thought of Mark, of their shared memories, of warnings unheeded. The camera lens flickered. Mark's eyes narrowed as he observed it. His hand reached out hesitantly, lifting the camera. He peered through the viewfinder, and in that instant, Owen surged a ripple of ethereal energy through the lens. Owen, is that you? Mark whispered, setting the camera down like it was made of glass. A mixture of disbelief and terror colored his voice. Owen pulsed the light twice as a crude nod. Though he could not utter words, Owen was able to send fragmented thoughts. Ritual, freedom, remorse, each impression blooming in Mark's mind. Mark's eyes widened with understanding. Mark gathered ancient tomes and handwritten notes, his hands shaking as he arranged them around the camera. The air grew dense, filled with the musk of burning sage and the electricity of an approaching storm. His voice wavered as he recited incantations long lost to the tongues of men. A luminescent vortex spiraled within the lens, swirling into an ephemeral bridge between two realms. One by one, the captured souls floated towards it, vanishing in bursts of luminance. Each exit sent a ripple of emotion, relief, sorrow, gratitude. As Owen's form neared the vortex, he hesitated. He looked back at the multitude of souls, their forms now invigorated with colors of emotions long lost. Then he stepped through. The first thing Owen felt as he returned to his earthly body was sensation. The cold air biting his skin, the weight of gravity, his heart pounding like a desperate drum. His eyes met Mark's, who was overcome with relief but also a heavy sadness. "I can't believe it worked," Mark sighed, but the furrows on his brow betrayed unresolved tension. As Owen looked around his studio, the sense of euphoria began to wane. It was as if a residue had clung to his soul, a scar of ethereal darkness that reminded him of his transgressions. Mark seemed to sense it, his eyes clouded with a complexity of emotions, happiness, disappointment, and a sliver of fear. With a deep breath, Owen picked up the antique camera, his hands trembling, and smashed it onto the ground. The splintering sound felt like a momentary release, but it wasn't complete. He picked up the lens, the core of their agony, and placed it in a lockbox. A grim keepsake, a reminder never to tread such a dark path again. Weeks passed, and the town was awash with talk of a miraculous recovery wave hitting the people who had been emotionless. Yet, whispers of their hollow gazes and scars of indescribable experiences kept the townsfolk unnerved. Owen avoided the public eye, drenched in a mix of guilt and relief. And then came the news. The antique shop had burned to the ground. It was reported as an accident, but Owen felt an unsettling sensation as if an invisible noose around his neck had slightly loosened. Life had almost returned to its mundane cycle when Owen received an anonymous package. With apprehensive hands, he unwrapped it to reveal a lens, identical to the one he had locked away. Attached was a note that sent shivers down his spine. "For your next project." Owen felt as if the walls of his studio were closing in on him again, but this time, the prison was one of a different making. The temptation lay before him, an endless loop of choices, each darker than the other. And for the first time, Owen realized that some doors, once opened, could never be fully closed. And so, dear listeners, we close the unsettling chapter of The Soul Photographer. A tale of curiosity, transgressions, and inescapable consequences. A grim reminder that some doors, once cracked open, will haunt you forever. If you felt an unsettling tingling down your spine, then we've done our job. Sleep well, or try to, until next time, when we'll pull back the curtain on another macabre tale. Until then, keep the lights on and beware the darkness. This is our Scary Stories signing off for tonight.